listener, this is podcast 40 and we're on the Wiggly sofa this week, but we've got a special. Richard and I are bowing out, aren't we, Rich?
Yep.
And handing over to Farmer Phil, who's talking to Melanie Matthews from TB Alert, because she has emailed him to tell him how he's wrong about TB in certain aspects.
Should make for good listening.
Should do. Over we go to Phil on a Skype interview with Melanie.
Good morning, Melanie. This is Farmer Phil on his first Skype interview for the Wiggly Podcast, and we're talking this morning to Melanie Matthews from TB Alert. Melanie, perhaps you could start off by telling us briefly what TB Alert is.
Hi Phil, nice to meet you on Skype. Yeah, TB Alert is a charity in the UK which is concerned with tuberculosis in the UK and overseas. Now, we're not actually a charity which deals with bovine TB, which is what we were going to talk about. But because I've learnt a lot about TB, I've also, along the way, learnt quite a lot about bovine TB too. So it's something that quite interests me.
And of course, bovine TB and human TB are not entirely unrelated.
They're not, no. People can catch bovine TB, and in terms of how it's treated, how it's diagnosed, what it looks like, what it feels like to the person, it's pretty much exactly the same thing. The bacteria looks a little bit different under a microscope, apparently.
I was going to say that there are several different varieties of TB, but they are fairly closely related, and I think I'm right in saying that the pasteurisation of dairy products is almost entirely as a means of making sure that humans don't contract bovine TB. Would that be right?
That's correct, yes. Before pasteurisation, and in countries where they don't have pasteurisation of milk, one of the biggest killers was TB, and often TB of the stomach. Most people think of it as a lung disease, but that's generally when you breathe it in. With unpasteurised milk, you're drinking it, and TB can affect you in the stomach. And in fact, sort of a few hundred years ago, it was one of the biggest killers in this country.
Hence the Victorian sanatoriums dotted around in drafty places on top of hills.
Exactly.
And so on.
They decided, because they couldn't cure it, there was nothing that they could do to cure it. The only thing they could do is keep the people away from other people so they wouldn't pass on. Because if you have TB of the lungs, it can be infectious. So keep them away from other people, give them lots of fresh air, good food, lots of rest, and just hope that by building up their immune system with good food and lots of rest, they would be able to fight it. And some of them did, and if they didn't, they died.
Now, the reason we came into contact was basically because I'd made another of my sweeping comments on the podcast, and you quite reasonably pulled me up on it, and I basically, I think, led the general public to believe that I was saying that TB was incurable.
That's
and,
right,
and
yes,
you
and
came back
I
to me
got on my high horse and thought, no, you can't say that.
Well, fair enough. So really what your point was that TB is entirely curable, but it takes a long time because it's difficult to actually get at the bacteria within the body, isn't it?
It is. Well, it is entirely curable. We now use a sort of combination of drugs. The first drug that was invented, they thought this is wonderful, this is curing TB, and then they realised that the bacteria were changing and being resistant to that drug. So we now use a combination of 4 drugs which prevents that drug resistance. But the TB bacteria grows and multiplies very, very slowly, and because of that, it takes a long time to kill them all off. And in this country, generally treatment is 6 months. Depending on the treatment regime, it can be anything from 6 to 9 months.
Yeah.
And if somebody does have drug-resistant TB, whether because they've caught drug-resistant TB from someone else or because they've had bad treatment or not finished taking their treatment, which is why doctors always say you must finish taking your antibiotics. If they have drug-resistant TB, it could take a couple of years. So it's not easy, but it's easy in the sense of we have the drugs, we know how to cure it.
I was just going to say that in animals, the treatment of TB has 2 issues. One, it's illegal, but that's basically because of the government strategy on eradicating it.
Right.
But also the actual problems of treating an animal for that length of time, both in terms of cost and practicality, get very difficult.
Yeah.
And also you've got to isolate it fairly obviously from the other animals. So that's where the problems start with that. But having said that, it then goes on to your thoughts on the ways that it might be tackled within animals and the way it might be spread. Now, you mentioned that there was some thoughts within your circle of contacts that TB was being spread by illegal, possibly, movements of animals post foot and mouth.
Well, this is something that I must just say, this is not talking as sort of on behalf of the charity, because, as I say, we don't actually deal with bovine TB. But I've been talking to a lot of people about bovine TB, and I think it's fascinating that there is such different opinions about badgers. Some people I speak to think that if you could just get rid of all the badgers, you'd get rid of all bovine TB. It's all their fault. Others think there's other ways to deal with it. One person I spoke to said that although the badgers are being blamed for the increase, because bovine TB is on the increase at the moment, and badgers are being blamed, his theory was that movements of cattle since foot and mouth have been to blame, and he feels, I don't know how true this is, that some of the movements aren't all legal.
I would suspect that he's not entirely wrong. Whether I think that they contribute much to TB is difficult to say. I mean, certainly the TB testing has been extremely rigorous, and I can't actually see how you could get away with not having your stock tested. Right. Then you get into the realms of, are there animals being moved that have tested perhaps negative but have still got TB?
Yeah.
And obviously, to be infectious, the animal has got to be showing tangible symptoms. It's got to be coughing and ill. So that I suspect, although it might be that, I don't think that's the main reason from my point of view, but then again, I wouldn't, would I?
Absolutely. But I was interested to hear about your thoughts on badgers, and I think a lot of people that I've spoken to are starting to think this way, although it isn't what Defra's saying. But if the badgers are healthy, then the cows are going to be healthy. If there is any passing between the two, then preventing badgers getting ill and infectious seems to be a good way to prevent your cows getting it. And obviously a way to avoid killing any badgers.
That's right. And also, I mean, if the badger population have got TB, the badger population are not going to be very well. And therefore that it's to the benefit of them as well as the cattle to get rid of TB in badgers. I have been interested in, and this was reiterated by talking to you, was that the idea that if your badgers are unstressed, and to some extent if your cattle are unstressed and healthy, they have a resistance to picking up infections like TB.
Absolutely.
And I was actually talking to somebody yesterday, and we were putting the idea around the table that if you inoculate animals, or humans for that matter, with, for want of a better phrase, beneficial bacteria, that these sort of probiotic treatments could help with TB, in as much that they go that step further and promote bacteria which would then oust the TB. The good bacteria would multiply at the expense of the TB. I wonder what your thoughts were on that sort of...
Well, that's absolutely fascinating, because completely coincidentally yesterday I was looking up information about a gentleman that I'd come across who is developing exactly that, and the idea, I was reading the transcript of something that he'd said, which is basically they were calling it the dirt vaccine, and basically they were saying that people nowadays in a sense are too clean. Children aren't eating enough dirt, as it were, and that's possibly the reason why we're not having the resistance to things like asthma, possibly lung cancer, possibly TB, and they're looking at developing bacteria. It can actually can give people a better level of immunity and possibly prevent things like asthma and possibly TB. And it does sound very sensible. I mean, it's something that my mum's always said, you've got to give children a bit of dirt to build up their immunity. And one of the things that this guy said was that when they've done checks on children from exactly the same kind of social levels, children who are brought up on farms are much less likely to get asthma. And children who are brought up with lots of older brothers are also less likely to get asthma, and they think that's because older boys are muckier.
And do you, in the context of human TB, do you find that borne out by children and humans in less developed countries are subjected to much less sterile environments? Are you seeing that they have a resistance to TB which is not necessarily... means that they don't catch TB at the same rate as you would have perhaps predicted them to? Well,
that's difficult, because overlaid on that is the extreme poverty in the countries where we work. So if there were any of that phenomenon happening, it would be very difficult to see it, because the problem with TB is that poverty causes all of the things that make you more likely to get TB. So you're living in poor conditions, you've got poor nutrition, you haven't got poor healthcare. And as you said with with cows and with badgers, if a person is stressed, if their immune system is stressed, then they're much more likely to get TB. The other problem we've got in many developing countries, like in Africa, is HIV, and again that's affecting the immune system. So that may well be the case, and that people have said that it's interesting that in some countries there seems to be different levels of certain mycobacteria, environmental mycobacteria, that are giving people some form of immunity. But I think in many poor countries that's being overridden by poverty.
Yeah, the same bacteria group that we use to make our bokashi that you've probably heard us talking about.
I've just got myself a bokashi bin.
Excellent. Well, in Japan and other countries, that same bacteria group, the EM sort of mix then, if you like, are used as probiotics in animal feeds and so on. And there is some evidence there's quite a lot of evidence to suggest that this is showing your dirt vaccine type phenomenon.
Yeah.
And it was really, the discussion was, well, if that works in that way, then the chances are that, given that TB is a bacteria, it could well help with that. But I see of last week that DEFRA's latest idea, because they like modern things, as you know, is that they're going to try and test vaccinating the badgers with BCG.
Right.
Because they can't vaccinate the cattle, because that then renders the TB test useless. And it also has political implications with the import and export of cattle. So they've chosen the not terribly obvious route, in my mind, of trying to vaccinate badgers. So that I don't know whether you have any thoughts on the likely success of that or not.
The BCG vaccination isn't 100%. And that's another reason why in some countries they don't use it on humans or animals. And also for the reason that, as you say, having the vaccine builds an immune reaction, which means that the skin test that you do to test for TB, which is testing for that immune reaction, is confused by the BCG. So in some countries they say, well, we'd rather know for sure whether somebody's been in contact with TB, and then we can treat them for that, rather than masking it with this BCG, which seems to work anything from 20 to 80% effectiveness, depending on where you are, and possibly depending on the environmental mycobacteria that you've come into contact with as well, because it may be also that they give you a skin test before you get the BCG, and some people already have a level of immunity, which may be from being in contact with TB and their body having sort of dealt with it, or it may be from environmental mycobacteria as well. So it's an interesting one, and there's all sorts of issues about BCG in this country at the moment, because the government has decided not to automatically vaccinate all children at secondary school, because they're saying, well, the pattern of TB in this country has changed, and it's better to only vaccinate high-risk children, and we'll vaccinate them at a very young age, sort of under 1. Going back to the badgers, well, firstly, vaccinating the badgers isn't going to work 100%. I'd be interested to know how they're going to make sure they find all the badgers and vaccinate all the new badgers.
I think the actual problems of vaccinating them in the first place is one problem, but actually then monitoring the success of the vaccine is going to get even harder. But
I mean, it's a tough thing to monitor, and you speak to different doctors in this country, and as I say, nobody's really come up with a definitive answer as to how well BCG works on humans, and it's a lot easier to monitor then. So how they're going to monitor whether it works in badgers is another.
It all sounds like work in progress. Well, it's absolutely fascinating talking to you, Melanie, and we should keep in touch in terms of if more, as more information becomes available, either way.
Thanks for having me on.
Well, it's great, and I've no doubt we'll speak to you again, and we'll perhaps have mastered technology a bit better then.
Yes, I hope so. Thanks a lot. I'll listen to the podcast.
Thanks, Melanie. Bye for now.
Thank you, Phil. See you all next week, and if you want to subscribe to the Wiggly Podcast, go to www.wigglywiggles.co.uk/podcasts, and then subscribe via iTunes, and that way it automatically lands on your computer every single week. Bye.
Bye.